One when he's like 21 years old. Because of his highly realistic comic art, ABC TV, which had the Ben Casey TV show at the time, wanted to do a comic strip version, and they hired Neal Adams because of his photographic realism to draw the strip. And at the time, Neal Adams was the youngest artist ever at 21 to have his own nationally syndicated daily strip and Sunday strip. And you can see in these daily strips how Neal was really pushing the boundaries of the 4 panels a day daily strip by breaking out of that mold. Look at this Sunday strip in which you can see the head of Ben Casey when you kind of squint, but yet each panel works individually, propelling the narrative. And that's why 2 or 3 years later, when he went into comics, he brought that same concept into his Dead Man, because when you squint, you can see Dead Man's entire head, but it's made up of separate panels. And it was Dead Man's head and Neal Adams' facility with human expressions that really set his art apart from everybody else's. I was 10 years old when this issue came out, and I remember staring at this cover for what seemed like hours, how the artist got that pink head in the background. We didn't know about what became known as color holds. And you can see in this transition, written by Arnold Drake, how Neal Adams' facility with realistic human emotion made the words of the writer really sing and ring true. Now, of course, Dead Man was frustrated that he could never find his killer, and each one of his adventures didn't have a happy ending. And when you look at this 2-page sequence of Dead Man's Scream, once again, it's Neal Adams' facility with human emotion and his ability to abstract anatomy and use the dynamics of Kirby, but in a more realistic way, that made Dead Man stand out from the mold of really every other comic character. And then, in the summer of '68, Neal Adams wants to draw Batman, but the editor of Batman already has artists assigned to the title. So Neal Adams goes to the editor of Brave and Bold, the Batman team-up title, Murray Boltinoff, and he basically says, listen, I'd love to draw Batman, let me draw Batman, and let's team him up with the Dead Man character and see what happens. Now, this issue comes out in the summer of '68, but here's the issue right before, just to show you the way Batman looked before Neal Adams does him. And here's 2 issues before, drawn by Ross Andrew. And here's Carmine Infantino's Batman a couple of months before, and you can see where all of these other artists were getting their Batman from. Now here's Neal Adams' first Batman cover in late '67, 6 months before that Brave and Bold issue, and you can see he's still trying to find his way. This was probably Neal Adams drawing over a Carmine Infantino layout. But that brings us to this issue. In the summer of '68, only 3 months after the Batman TV show left the air. So we were still left with the kind of campy caped clown of the Adam West TV show, and the comics, as you can see, followed suit. But when we opened up this issue, all of a sudden, we began to see a different Batman, a Batman that we hadn't really seen before. Meaning, we never really saw a realistically drawn Batman from angles like this. We were used to the Infantino Batman head. I mean, look at that mouth. That's not a realistic mouth. That's a comic book mouth. Very different from Neal Adams, who had that facility for realism. And the reason why this blew our minds was because we were already used to Dead Man having that realistic facial expression that Adams was great at. So we also began to see in these individual panels in this single issue, Batman, he put the bat in Batman that we had never seen before. The flowing cape, things that you're used to now with the Dark Knight of today. There'd be no Dark Knight if it wasn't for what Neal Adams did in this single issue. He went back to the original conception by Bob Kane in 1939 of Batman as a creature of the night with his cape kind of like bat wings. But Adams drew it more realistically in this single issue. And in this one issue, overnight, we get the Dark Knight of today. And like I said, there would be no Dark Knight if it wasn't for what Neal Adams did 3 months after this issue, I mean, this was the image of Batman that we had in our minds. So that makes this issue one of the groundbreaking issues that came out in 1968. Now, Adam's contemporary was the great Jim Steranko. And this issue of S.H.I.E.L.D. comes out in the spring of '68, maybe one of the greatest comic book covers of all time. Now, where did Steranko get Nick Fury from, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D.? Well, it begins with the James Bond craze of the 1960s, a couple of years earlier, 1964, 65, with Goldfinger and Thunderball. Now, how did comic books knock off the James Bond craze? Well, DC did his usual goofy version, like this, but what did Jack Kirby do with the James Bond craze? He decides to take Sergeant Fury from the 1940s, shown here a couple years earlier, and bring him into the 1960s. Now, we know the term rebooting in pop culture. Well, I think this has to count as the first reboot of a character in American pop culture, certainly in comics, because look at what Kirby does by bringing Nick Fury into 1965. And this was one of Marvel's, I call it a B title, but in December of '66, we noticed something different. And what was different? The signature. We knew Kirby, but who or what was a Steranko? Well, here's what Steranko did. He would take the Kirby power that you can see in this image from Captain America in 1965, and he kind of gave it back to us on steroids. So this is Steranko and S.H.I.E.L.D. taking the Kirby look and psychedelicizing it. This is kind of, in a single image, everything that he did with Nick Fury. He really made him the first kind of jumpsuited character with all the gadgets, everything you're used to seeing on anime characters today, you could find in Nick Fury. And like I said, while Kirby did some incredible double-page spreads, Steranko's double-page spreads were like on acid. And in fact, Steranko was not just, he didn't want to just do double-page spreads, he actually did 4-page spreads. So this image, you had to buy 2 issues of the comic book to get the entire spread and lay the 2 issues next to each other to achieve the look that Steranko intended. And he brought in all the psychedelic imagery that was in the 60s with artists like Peter Max into the comics like nobody had ever done before, and images that we're still trying to figure out how he did them. And if you look at this transition of the Scorpio character, Steranko probably was influenced by this classic issue from 1968 in January of Richard Avedon's famous photographs of the Beatles in the kind of psychedelic aura that they had back then. But look at how Steranko also mixed photography with psychedelic art in his S.H.I.E.L.D. The covers that he did in 1968 are all landmarks that have been paid homage to multiple times, but this mixture of collage and photography with comic art. Here's a splash page from 1968 as well. Look at the hip bachelor pad that Nick Fury had. And once again, you can see Steranko using a photograph of the skyline, and then look at the op art he has on the wall. Op art was very big in the mid-60s. This is Bridget Riley, who was considered the doyenne of op art. This is from her 1965 opening at the Museum of Modern Art. And you can see how Steranko kind of was influenced by that image when he did his classic S.H.I.E.L.D. cover. Again, one of the greatest covers of all time. At the same time this issue came out, Peter Max was doing images like this, which is what the lay public, when they think of 1968 and psychedelia, they think of images like this, and you can see the influence on Steranko's cover. But Steranko was also reaching into the comic book past and being influenced by Will Eisner. Now, you got to remember, in 1968, none of us really knew who Will Eisner was. I think Harvey did a couple of annuals in 1966 that came and went. But Steranko was aware of Eisner from 20 years earlier and kind of took from those classic splash pages and did his own versions of them in 1968 as well. This is the splash page following that great psychedelic cover of his. And then when you turn this page, you got this famous double-page spread that when Steranko brought it into Marvel's offices, Sal Brodsky, the production manager, didn't want to pay him as a writer because he said there weren't any words on the page. Why should I pay you for writing? So that's one of the reasons why Steranko ended up leaving Marvel by 1970. And once again, you can see his radical layout choices, his depiction of Steranko. You actually had to almost turn the pages around to read the story that Steranko was telling. Now, some might view this as a psychedelic layout. This image comes out the same time Robert Crumb is doing images like this in underground comics, except without the narrative that Steranko had to adhere to. There's really no narrative here. Now, Robert Crumb, one of the greatest artists of all time, the greatest cartoonist of our generation, but in 1968, he was put on the map by this classic album cover for Janis Joplin. Now, I could do a whole lecture, obviously, on Crumb and underground comics. Suffice it to say, Crumb was the face of the birth of underground comics. Because years earlier, growing up, he was drawing his own comics that looked like this. This is like from 1959. So he's 18 years old here. 1961, Arcade. These are comics he ended up resuscitating in the 70s. But then Crumb gets a job with American Greetings in the early 60s, and this is where he honed his style with his lettering and his imagery that was both radical and yet fun and familiar as well. This is the equivalent of what Neil Adams was doing over at Johnstone and Cushing. So both men are born in 1941, of military fathers. They both love comics. They both apprentice in commercial comics for advertising. And the difference between the two men is one drops acid and the other doesn't. Anyway, oh, what happened here? Okay, so following that, he starts doing his own comics featuring, that's a drawing of his wife, Dana. He starts doing covers for all of the new newspapers that were for the counterculture at the time, like Yarrow's and the East Village Other. The concept of head comics with the growth of marijuana smoking becomes a thing, and Crumb becomes the kind of image, the image of underground comics. And it's in these early comics that we begin to see the images that we would become associated with Robert Crumb. Now there's his wife Dana. They're living in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury, which became, ground zero, the psychedelic movement. This is a drawing Crumb did years later of how they sold the first real underground comic, Zap Comics #1, on the streets of Haight-Ashbury in early 1968. And here's the issue of Zap Comics #1. I mean, there were other little issues, and I do a whole lecture on the history of underground comics, but for all intents and purposes, Zap 1 is the first real underground comic, and it comes out in 1968, one of the great comics of this incredible year. Now, with the growth of psychedelia, and in 1968, it was Marvel Comics, spelled with an X, like Marvel Comics, that began to get the media coverage of being, emblematic of the 60s. And you can see in these various spreads how Marvel was positioned to take advantage of all this media attention on comics. And that Spider-Man figure is taken from, again, even though it's dated January 69, this issue comes out in 1968. Now, DC Comics, of course, their approach was always goofier than Marvel. This was DC Comics' idea of how to deal with what was happening in the 60s. Very different. DC was like the establishment trying to be hip, whereas Marvel was hip. Look at a comic DC puts out in the middle of 1968 that is either the butt of everybody's jokes about, when DC tried to be hip with Brother Power the Geek. I mean, look at this house ad. Make the Scene. I mean, it's all older people trying to speak in the language of younger people. And this comes out at the same time Life magazine is doing stories like this about the hippies. So this idea was very much in the air in the middle of 1968. Now, speaking of images torn from the day's headlines, we bring the great Steve Ditko and his 1968 creations, The Hawk and Dove and Creeper. Now, Steve Ditko, who just passed away this year, he was the co-creator of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. He was also the sort of J.D. Salinger, Greta Garbo of Marvel Comics, because very few pictures exist of him. He never really gave interviews, didn't allow his photograph to be taken. But it was Steve Ditko's Spider-Man that is still, to this day, the greatest version of the character. Even though many great artists have drawn him, it's Spider-Man by Ditko and it's Doctor Strange by Ditko that remain the quintessential versions of those characters. But in '66, he leaves Marvel. He leaves Doctor Strange, he leaves Spider-Man, and these were reasons that he only recently revealed why he left Spider-Man and Marvel. It had to do with his working relationship with Stan Lee. But suffice it to say, when Ditko left Marvel, he goes to Charlton Comics and creates a kind of Spider-Man knockoff named the Blue Beetle. And you can see the first issue here appearing in 1967. But more salient to our 1968 discussion is who is the Question, the backup feature in the Blue Beetle. And we have never seen a character like this. I mean, dressed in a business suit, but with no face. What the? But you know, Ditko, so inventive, he actually shows us how the character achieves that no-face look. But what made the first story of the Question stand out from all other superheroes was when you get to the end, where he knocks off the two villains into the sewer underground, and as they're drifting away, the villain says, "Do something, we can't hold on." Now, every movie and television show and comic book we had ever read or seen, the good guy always saves the bad guy. He never lets the bad guy die. But what did we get in this first issue of the Question? Why tell me your problems? And the bad guys are like, you have to save us, you must. And in dialogue that is still trenchant today, 50 years later, this is what Ditko has the Question saying. You're both crazy to think I'd risk my neck to save the likes of you. As far as I'm concerned, you're just so much sewage, and you deserve to be right where you are. And as they get pulled away, you're inhuman, you can't leave us here. You've got to save us, it's your duty. It's like, duty to whom? Now, according to the behind-the-scenes story of Stephen Skates, the dialogue writer who worked with Ditko on this, he says that the publisher made him put this last word balloon in about how the crooks might survive because they felt it was too intense to literally have them die at the end. But that was one of the great issues in 1968, and then we get the only issue of the Question in his own comic that many consider disappearing in the summer of '68, one of the single greatest issues in comic history. And what made that issue great in the classic Ditko 9 panels to a page format is this splash page panel in which Ditko talks about what makes a hero. Is a hero somebody that puts on a costume and fights crime? Or is a hero somebody who stands up for what they believe in against all odds and against all of society? Now this is a marked difference to his approach on Spider-Man, in which Spider-Man was always the neurotic, doubting himself and moping about his problems. And Ditko, one of the reasons maybe why he left Spider-Man was he didn't like this approach for a hero. And that's why you get a character like the Question. And in the past 50 years, the Question has become, in Ditko's absence, a part of the DC universe. There was this series that started out in the, I think, mid-'80s and ran for many years by Dennis O'Neil and Dennis Cowan. And then, of course, you get to 1986 and you get The Watchmen, who is basically Alan Moore's version of the Question. And, you know, the Question is now one of the great DC characters. He has his own action figure. DC just did another like a prequel or whatever to The Watchmen. So you can see how Ditko's character, the Question from 1968, is alive and well in comics today. Now that isn't the only 1968 comic of Ditko's, because we also get the debut of his character, the Creeper, who at the time was seen as a bit of another Spider-Man knockoff with the same kind of figure, abstraction that Ditko was known for. And you can see on